Hey, I thought I would do a quick video on how my router lift works. I had a few comments, especially about locking it. This knob right here, this handle, you could say, which is not tight because I just put it on basically a little while ago. Need 2 wrenches to tighten up the nuts, is the locking handle. And normally it's just loose like that when you're adjusting the lift up and down. And then when you get it in position, you'll tighten that in, and that threaded rod pushes against that short 1/4 inch hex screw that's in part I. And that pushes against the side of the carriage here and locks it in position so it can't shift. And then when you want to adjust it, you loosen that up and wheel the lift up and down. Now, I call this a precision lift because you're able to position the bit very precisely with this. Like each turn of this will move it up a very small amount. And that's the way I wanted this to work. I don't want this to move rapidly. Just a very small movement of this crank will lift it up or lower it by just a few thousandths. So you can get very, very precise cuts with this. And then after you have it adjusted, lock the handle in place and it will not move. And that's one of the things about this. When I was designing this, I wanted it to be bulky. I wanted it to be rugged. I wanted it to be strong. I wanted it to resist movement. I wanted it to resist vibration. I wanted it to resist chatter. Chatter is a big problem with flimsier lifts because the body of the router will move around. In this one, it's solidly mounted on the carriage here. It cannot move. Also, the carriage itself is locked into that track that cannot move after you tighten the handle up. So it's all very rigid, so you can make some pretty heavy cuts in this, not have to worry about the router wobbling back and forth. So if I flip it around, you can see how it works. This part goes back and forth, and it lifts this part up and down because it's rolling on this bearing here that's in that angled track. That's an inclined plane, it's called. And it's a very trouble-free mechanism. Nothing's going to go wrong with this. It may get tight over time, but you can easily take it apart and re-lubricate it or re-space the parts, no problem. I have had the original one that I made in this over here, and it's been in there for the past 6 years, I think, and it still works fine. It works great. No problems whatsoever. Also, I designed the lift to be made with plywood. Plywood is dimensionally stable. It doesn't move all over the place. You definitely don't want to be making something like this with solid wood. I would pick the best plywood that I could find. I use Baltic birch here, and I highly recommend that. Well worth it to get that plywood to make this. You really don't need a big piece of it anyway. You need a piece that's like 27 inches wide by 24. And then a very small piece of 3/4 inch as well. This center section right here is the actual lift. And these things on the end here are just the mounting brackets. And that's the way you would adjust this lift when you're mounted on the table. You could shim these down or up depending upon how it lines up. What you would want to do is get a 1/2 inch bar and put it in your router here and use a square to square that to the table while you shim different points on these brackets to make it absolutely 90 degrees to the table. My original is under the extension wing of my table over here, and it's been there, like I say, for the past 6 years in my shop. My shop is not really well heated, and it's not air conditioned, so there are pretty big fluctuations in humidity in here. And it has suffered no, it hasn't locked up or anything like that. It's worked perfectly. Every time I go to use it, it works perfectly. And I didn't finish that in any way. I just lubricated the tracks like I did here with Vaseline, and I left the rest of it plain. And that's really the way I would recommend putting this together. Finish on these parts is not a good idea because, okay, some types of finish are sticky after you put them on. So if you are determined to finish this, I would recommend just using like 2 or 3 coats of water-based polyurethane. Make sure that they're dry between coats, and then make sure that you coat all the parts before you start assembly so that you can shim everything out and space everything out properly. So you get the clearance. All this requires clearance. The router lift over here needs to be tighter. This mechanism that slides back and forth here can be really sloppy. It doesn't have to be accurate at all. It works better if it's accurate, but you can leave a lot of space in around these parts here and it'll still work perfectly because all it needs to do is slide back and forth here and lift and lower the router carriage, and it's the router carriage track that has to be accurate. The vertical range of this lift is 3.5 inches, and that's probably more than you'll actually need for most things. One thing about it though is that it will lift the router up high enough so that you can actually change the bits above the table, providing your table is not some insane thickness.